Hi, Steve Smith here again. Thank you for tuning in, and this is my 8th presentation and the third one focused on grammar. In number 6, I did a sort of theoretical introduction to aspects of teaching grammar. Then in number 7, we talked about lexicogrammar, and in this case the focus is on question-answer technique and similar sorts of drills. Check out my Twitter handle there, and that's my blog address there, frenchteachernet.blogspot.com. So here we go. Here's a reminder of the National Centre of Excellence recommendations. That's the ncelp.org website. Key recommendations about teaching grammar. So a quick reminder that they recommend explicit but succinct descriptions of grammatical features, practice of the point in input language, listening and reading, output practice, an opportunity at some point but much later in the teaching cycle for free writing and speech. They also happen to recommend using standard grammatical terminology and building on prior knowledge. So this particular presentation is focusing at those points I've highlighted in red, how we can use grammatical features in a structured way in input language, particularly listening, and also provide practice in the productive use. What do we mean by this? Well, question-answer drills were developed as part of a language teaching method which really developed, I suppose, from about the 1920s onwards. A number of people were involved in this approach. In particular, I'd mention Harold E. Palmer, who you can see on the right, who was a teacher and then a writer who really developed in detail the oral approach, sometimes called the oral situational approach. The main features of the approach were, although syllabuses were still designed on a grammatical sequence, the focus was really on oral practice, avoiding the written language in the early stages, not explaining rules in great detail, but providing structured inputs so that students could work out rules. So it was about picking up grammar through structured and very contrived sorts of dialogues or conversations in the form of classroom question and answer. So here's a reminder of the sorts of questions we're talking about. So on the left-hand side here, we've got things like true-false statements that can be corrected, yes-no questions, simple things like, Tom's a cat? Yes or no. Question word questions where there might be a slight change in word order. Is Tom a cat? Answer, yes or no. That one requires a little bit more processing from a student's point of view because of the word order change. Then we have either-or questions, which demand a little bit more processing. For example, is Tom a cat or a dog? But the answer is still in the question, and the answer is a cat. Then we have an extension of the either-or question, what you might call the multi-choice question. Is Tom a dog, cat, elephant, or crocodile? Notice how much input there that students are getting, and the answer is still in the question. It's a cat. And then the hardest sort of question is the question word question itself. What is Tom? And clearly that's harder from a student's point of view because they've got to retrieve the language, in this case cat, from their memory. It's not provided for them. So it needs to be there in long-term memory or held in recent working memory. So that's just a reminder of the sorts of questions you can use at all levels, not just beginners, by the way. And notice that you can use these questions to differentiate between students during classroom oral work. So you might choose, if you were to use the cold calling technique or the no hands up approach, you could direct easier questions to your less proficient students and more sophisticated, tougher questions to your more able students. There are variations though on question and answer which I want to mention to you. For example, where you just make a false statement for students to correct, where students make up false statements which you can correct or which maybe their partner can correct. The sort of drill where you simply change one element in the sentence. For example, if you gave as a prompt, yesterday I played tennis, and they have to come back and say, yesterday I played, let's say, football, for example. Oral question and answer work can work through different modes, so it doesn't have to be just oral questions with oral answers. It could be oral questions with written down answers. And often writing them down could come after a section of the lesson where you've done just the oral work. Then we also have the opportunity of doing teacher-led questioning leading to paired questioning, the sort of turn and talk technique, where let's say partner A could play the role of teacher and partner B could be answering the questions, but where they would simply be doing the same questions that you had previously modelled. And some students would be good enough to design their own questions, for example, make up a worksheet as a homework. Once they've picked up your way of working and see how questions work, then they could make up their own. Now I'm going to look at this sequence in much more detail in another presentation, but here's a very useful way of exploiting question, answer and similar interactions. So here we have a description, a graphic description of a visit to Paris as it happens, but you could make up similar things very easily. The focus here would be, for example, on past tense or future tense. So you might, roughly speaking, teach it like this: describe the sequence in the target language, and then do some choral repetition, maybe some individual repetition, and then go into your questioning sequence at that point. For example, did you leave the house at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock? 9 o'clock. Did you go to the bus station or the train station? The train station. Did you travel by plane, bus or bicycle? Or train? The answer was train. What time did the train leave? 9:30. So there I'd modelled some of those different questions from the questioning hierarchy, and within a lesson you could do those individually. You could then move to, say, having a student describe the first line, another student doing the second line, and gradually building up the whole story. But I will talk about that more in detail another time. Now, questions and answers can be used within the context of task-type games, and this game you may know it already, but just in case you don't, because it was such a favourite of mine with students who'd done, let's say, at least 3 years, maybe 4 years of language, and it's the alibi game, and it goes like this. So you tell the class at the beginning that there was a crime committed the night before. For example, an elderly person was attacked near the school and had their handbag taken from them. You tell the class this in a very deadpan fashion, and to start with, they'll probably look very serious and think you're telling the truth. You then add, it's believed that 2 people were responsible for this crime, and these 2 people were pretty young. In fact, they were about the same age as you. Now, at that point, 1 or 2 might begin to cotton on to the fact that this didn't actually happen. You then add, in fact, the 2 suspects are thought to come from our class, by which time most of the class realise that something is off here. So you then let them know, in fact, nothing happened, but we do need 2 volunteers who are going to leave the room and be suspects in this crime. Now, your 2 volunteers, preferably more proficient students in the class, have to leave the classroom for, say, 10 minutes at most, and between them prepare an alibi, something that they did together. It's important that it be something that they can corroborate between them, something, a shared activity like going to the cinema or the restaurant or staying in watching a movie, that sort of thing. While the 2 students are outside, the rest of the class can begin preparing questions with you, and as you prepare the sorts of questions you're going to ask, then you put them up on the board. Now, the link with grammar here is that you're going to be using past tenses, and in particular you'll use the standard perfect tense, the preterite, what did you do next, for example, alongside the imperfect tense, or the sort of past continuous tense, I was wearing, it was raining, we were doing, and so on. Now, with very proficient classes, you could make a real point about that and as you're modelling the questions, get them to notice the difference in meaning and form between those two tenses. With some classes, you might just want to focus on the meaning of the task and not correct too much in terms of the grammar. So you've got your questions prepared on the board, things like, what time did you do this? What were you wearing? What was the weather like? How did you get there? Who paid for the tickets? Whatever it might be. Of course, the class don't know what the two people have prepared, but the questions can be based on an imagined scenario. Then each of the two people comes in, one by one. You can get them to swear on your French dictionary, for example, and then the class asks questions using the prompts on the board, and you can help the process along yourself. After about 10 minutes, the second person comes in, and then they have to answer the same questions. Amusement usually follows when it's discovered how well they've prepared their alibi, or in some cases, how badly. But in any case, you might need a scribe or two to write down any differences in the two stories. And at the end of the lesson, which may take about 25 to 30 minutes, the class will vote on whether the pair are guilty or innocent. So it's a game strongly based on question and answer, which I think you could use with great success. Now, I mentioned that hierarchy of questions used in mainly teacher-led questioning, and these are sometimes called display questions. The technique is sometimes called circling by teachers who use the TPRS approach, mainly in the United States. And with younger learners, this sort of questioning is particularly useful when you're introducing simple grammar in the early stages. For example, possession. This is John's book. This is Peter's pen. Prepositions. Where is the computer? Where is the pencil case? Simple present tense verbs. Comparatives, for example, two pictures on the board with differences that need to be explained and so on. So the classic sort of question-answer technique would involve, let's say with prepositions, placing objects around the classroom and then asking questions such as, is the book on the table or under the table? It's on the table. Is the book on my head, on the computer, or on the table? It's on the table. Okay, the book's under the table. No, it's not. It's on the table. And so on and so on. And you could model a number of prepositions in that way. Now, that sort of conversation has the merits of being in the target language, comprehensible, but it's certainly contrived. It's not what you would call normal communication. After all, if there's a book on a table, who would normally ask, where is the book? It's pretty obvious where the book is. But students are happy to play along with this game, particularly if you tell them why you're doing it. It's easy to laugh at the technique, as Eddie Izzard did in his famous YouTube stand-up skit, which, if you haven't seen it, go and have a look. And he makes fun of this particular technique and how it doesn't necessarily apply to real use of language in real life. Question answers can also be used in simple information gap tasks. In this case, person A has their own diary for the previous week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You could translate these into English, by the way, if you wanted to make sure that the language is all totally comprehensible. And person B has a different grid with different activities, and they simply ask each other questions. What did you do? For example, what did you do Monday morning? And you would say, I went shopping in town with my mum. And so it goes on, each partner asking each other questions, and they write down their partner's answers on a blank version of this same grid. And of course, what you're getting there is multiple uses of past tense. In French, the passé composé. So lots of repetitions of chunked language, and we know how important chunking is, but focused on a grammar point. And then if you wanted to explicitly explain some grammatical forms afterwards for revision, then you could do that. That sort of activity wouldn't come early in the sequence of teaching on the perfect tense. It's the sort of thing that you do once you're still in the controlled practice stage, but not yet at the free production stage. So that's what person B's grid would look like, very similar. Those sorts of things are very easy to work out, and you can practice future tense, for example, in the same sort of way. So the advantages of this type of questioning technique and similar interactions is the amount of comprehensible input, the amount of listening, by the way, the opportunities for interaction, and we know that input and interaction are the keys for second language acquisition. We get bags and bags of repetition, and if you repeat these sorts of techniques over a number of lessons, then you're getting opportunities for spaced repetition. We also get opportunities for noticing grammatical forms. And earlier on in this presentation, do you remember the NCELP say how important it is for students to be able to notice how form works with meaning, and in line with the Schmidt noticing hypothesis, which I've talked about previously. So, as I said earlier, question and answer was a fundamental practice in that oral situational approach, which is summarized here. And there's also a slide presentation here about the oral approach. I've got lots of examples of lessons which are described in detail in my book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. And for me, it's quite close to my heart, actually, because when I trained as a teacher back in 1980, this was all the rage, and at the time was considered still fairly modern, although the communicative approach had arrived, and people became quite skeptical about this sort of artificial questioning technique. However, I would still stand by it as being one example of a way that you can use the target language in the classroom. And, if one of your aims is to improve or increase the amount of target language you use, then clever questioning technique could well be a good solution for you, and one that you can practice. So a reminder of 3 books I've been involved in there. So Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, our recent book Breaking the Sound Barrier, and our chunky handbook, the Language Teacher Toolkit. Next session, we're still focused on grammar, and in particular the idea of the audio-lingual drill. So drills have kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, but are they worth revisiting, and could they play a role for you as a teacher? So do you think it's about drill and kill, or is it drill and skill? Thanks for listening. See you next time.